She thought she could escape, but the terror was only beginning. A twisted game of cat and mouse that will leave you questioning how far someone will go to make you their prey. What happens when the hunter becomes unstoppable? Stick around to the shocking end. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. She thought she could escape. The dark alley stretched out before her, the damp air thick with tension. Her footsteps echoed, quick and frantic, as if the night itself was chasing her. The rain fell in sheets, the cold water soaking her clothes, clinging to her skin.
She was almost there. Just a few more steps.
The streetlight flickered ahead, its weak glow casting long shadows on the wet pavement. She looked behind her, heart pounding. Nothing. No sound. No movement. But then she heard it. A soft shuffle, like footsteps on wet concrete. Her breath caught in her throat. She quickened her pace, desperate now, the sound of her own footsteps drowned by the increasing rainfall. But then, the unmistakable crunch of gravel underfoot reached her ears. Too close. Too close. Her heart slammed against her ribs. He was behind her. She could feel it. His presence suffocating. His breath on her neck. A sudden gust of wind swept through the alley, and she heard his voice. A low whisper.
Cold. Hollow.
You're not getting away. She stumbled. Her knees weak beneath her. The alley seemed to stretch on forever. Endless. The light at the end, so close, now felt miles away. Her pulse raced, her skin prickling with dread. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. And then she saw him. Tall, imposing. A shadow in the rain. His face was hidden, but she knew. She knew who it was. She had known from the moment she heard his footsteps. Her body froze, but her mind screamed.
Run.
She turned, pushing herself forward. But it was too late. He grabbed her arm, yanking her back with such force, she almost lost her footing. The pain shot through her wrist, sharp and burning. She cried out. Where do you think you're going? He sneered. Her world tilted. She fought, kicking, clawing. But he was too strong. And then, in the darkness, she saw it. The glint of something cold, something metal. A knife. Her stomach churned. The blade flashed in the dim light. Please, please, she begged, but her voice faltered. He leaned in, his breath hot and foul against her skin. Not so fast, he whispered. And then, with a swift motion, the world around her blurred. She gasped for air. Her body locked in terror. Her vision wavered, dark spots creeping in from the edges. The air was thick, heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. She couldn't think, couldn't move. The rain beat down harder, but the cold didn't seem to matter anymore. All that mattered was the pressure on her arm, the sharp sting of the blade against her skin. He whispered again, but this time, the words were distorted, muffled by the roar of her own heartbeat. Her mind raced. A single thought surged through her. Escape. Her legs shook, her body screaming for movement. But she couldn't. He was everywhere, pressing in on her, blocking her way. His grip tightened. He was so close. His body against hers, suffocating. She could smell him, sweat, something metallic, and the sour scent of fear. She tried to focus. She couldn't let him see the panic on her face. She fought to steady her breath. She had to act. With all the strength she could muster, she twisted her body, jerking her arm free, just enough to throw herself off balance. For a moment she was free. She darted to the side, her feet slipping in the slick alley. The adrenaline was coursing through her, sharp and fierce. Her chest burned. She could feel the weight of her own terror in every breath. She ran. Her heart thudded in her ears. The sound of her desperate steps mingled with the deafening storm around her. She glanced back. He was there, still behind her. Close. She could hear his footsteps now, faster, louder, like the beat of a drum. Her body screamed for relief, for a break. But there was no time. She was reaching the street now, the promise of freedom just steps away. But her vision blurred again. The world spun. And then, the sharp pain exploded in her side.
A gasp. A cry.
She staggered, one hand clutching her ribs, the blood seeping through her fingers. Her legs buckled beneath her.
She was falling.
Everything slowed down. The rain felt distant, muffled, like a dream. She hit the ground hard. The wet concrete pressed into her cheek. The world faded to black. The coldness of the pavement seeped into her skin, but it didn't matter. She was fading. Her pulse, once frantic, slowed to a sluggish rhythm, barely hanging on. She could still hear him. His footsteps.
Closer now.
Deliberate. Her breath was shallow, each gasp a struggle, as though the air itself was too thick to swallow. She tried to move, but her body refused. Every muscle locked in place. The taste of blood lingered on her lips, bitter and metallic. His shadow loomed over her, blocking out the flickering streetlight above. For a moment, she thought she was safe. Maybe he would leave her. Maybe he thought she was dead.
But no.
He crouched down beside her, his presence suffocating. She felt the heat of his body, the pressure of his fingers brushing against her face. Her skin crawled. "You're not getting away," he said again, this time the words dripping with malice. Her eyes fluttered open, just a sliver. Her vision was blurry, but she could make out his figure. He was kneeling, his face still hidden in the shadows. The knife glinted in his hand, catching the dim light. The air around her thickened, pressing in like a vice. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The weight of his presence was crushing her. Her mind screamed for help, for escape. But there was no one. No one around. Just the rain, the silence. Him. The knife came closer, the blade gleaming wickedly. Her heart thudded again, each beat slower, weaker. She wanted to scream,
to fight.
But her body betrayed her. And then his voice, low and cruel. "You thought you could escape." He leaned in even closer, his breath hot against her ear. A sharp, guttural laugh escaped his lips. A laugh that chilled her to her very core. "You should have known better." The world began to tilt, the edges of her vision fading. Her body felt numb, unresponsive, as though she was sinking into a deep, endless void. The last thing she saw was his face, twisted with satisfaction. Then, everything went dark. The darkness wrapped around her, thick and suffocating. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, just emptiness. Her body felt as though it had disappeared into the night, swallowed whole. But then, slowly, very slowly, she became aware of something. The faintest pressure on her chest. A heartbeat, faint but alive. A noise, a low hum, reached her ears. Distant at first, but growing. A siren. It cut through the quiet like a blade, sharp and urgent. She tried to focus, tried to force her eyes open, but the world spun. Her fingers twitched, then curled into a fist. She could feel something beneath her, the rough texture of asphalt against her skin. A weight shifted, then lifted, as if someone was crouching beside her. Hands. Cold hands pressing against her chest, checking for life. Her breath came in shallow gasps, painful, as though her lungs were still trapped in that dark space. The siren grew louder. Closer. "Stay with me," a voice whispered. A stranger's voice. "You're safe now." Safe? The word didn't make sense.
Was she?
Was this real? Her eyelids fluttered, heavy like lead. The face above her came into focus, blurry at first, but then clearer. A man, his features obscured by the night, but his hands, steady, comforting, were real. A paramedic. She could tell now. He was working quickly, professionally, but there was a tightness to his expression. He had seen this before. The blood. the fear, the aftermath. But she was still here. She had survived.
Survived. How?
She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her voice barely a whisper. Help, she croaked, struggling to form the word. Hold on, he urged. Help is here. His voice was calm, but his hands were quick, securing something around her, a bandage. Everything felt so distant now. Her mind, still reeling from the shock, couldn't comprehend everything that had happened. She wanted to remember, wanted to understand, but she couldn't. It was all a blur. The world spun, then came into focus once again, and the sirens screamed louder, as if pulling her back into the light. The paramedic leaned closer. You're going to make it, he said, his voice firm now. Just hang on.
Her body felt weak.
Her mind hazy. But in that moment, as she slipped further from consciousness, she knew one thing. She had survived. At least for now. The world around her began to fade again, slipping away like sand through her fingers. She could feel the rough jostling of movement, the steady rise and fall of her chest as they lifted her, transported her to safety. But the images, the sounds, they blurred together in an indistinct haze. The sirens, so loud, so close, began to grow faint, distant, like an echo from another world. Her eyes fluttered open once more. Everything was too bright, too harsh. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled her nose. The sharp beep of machines echoed in the background. She was in a hospital now. A cold room, blank walls, a constant hum. She blinked, struggling to keep her eyes open. Faces swam in and out of her vision, medical staff moving around her. Their voices muffled, words indistinct. She couldn't focus. But then a voice, familiar, cut through the fog. She's awake, someone said. She tried to turn toward the sound, but her body felt heavy, like it wasn't her own. Can you hear me? The voice pressed.
It was gentle now, soothing.
A figure came into focus. A woman. Her face kind, her eyes warm. She nodded slowly. She could hear, but her mind was still too far from understanding. You're safe, the woman said again, her voice a lifeline. You're in the hospital. Do you remember? Remember. Her head throbbed, pain coursing through her skull as fragments of the night crashed through her mind.
The alley.
The knife. His face. Her breath caught in her throat.
She struggled to speak.
The woman's hands were on her, holding her steady. Sure, it's okay. We know. You're safe now. But she wasn't okay. Not really. The terror, the suffocating dread, lingered in her chest, wrapping its icy fingers around her heart. She couldn't shake the image of him, the face, the dark figure, looming over her, so close, his breath in her ear. She couldn't forget the feeling of his hand gripping her arm, dragging her back. The knife, the blood, his voice. You thought you could escape. It all rushed back, sharp and sudden. The coldness of the alley, the feeling of being trapped, cornered, with no way out. She closed her eyes, trying to push it all away. But the memories wouldn't leave. They followed her, haunted her, and now they lived within her. She could still feel him, in the pit of her stomach, in the spaces between her breaths. She couldn't escape. Not yet. The nightmare wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The memories clawed at her, relentless. Her chest tightened with each breath, as if the very air in the room had turned heavy with dread. She wanted to scream, to push it all away, but the words wouldn't come. She was still trapped, bound to the night, to him. The woman beside her must have sensed the shift, the way her face twisted with silent terror. It's okay, she whispered, her voice soft, reassuring, but there was a crack in it. A hint of worry. But how could it be okay? How could anything be okay after what she had just lived through? Her hands trembled as she lifted them, pressing them to her temples as if she could stop the storm raging inside her mind. The pulse of her thoughts, chaotic and wild, refused to settle. The woman's voice broke through again.
You're going to be okay.
We're here. We're going to help you. But the woman didn't know. She couldn't possibly understand. The terror hadn't gone anywhere. It was still here, alive in her veins, beating through her heart. She tried to sit up, but the weakness in her body stopped her. Her muscles ached. Her whole body felt like a shell, hollow and fragile. She looked down at her hands, still trembling. The blood that had once stained them washed away, but the feeling remained. The terror still gripped her. His voice echoed in her mind. You're not getting away. The memories kept coming, swirling in the darkness, more vivid with every passing second. She could still feel his presence, the way it had suffocated her in that alley. He was always there, always watching. Her breath hitched again. A figure moved at the door, stepping into the room. Her heart skipped. It was him. For a moment, the world tilted. She couldn't focus, couldn't think. Her vision blurred as panic surged, flooding her body with heat. But then, she blinked, her eyes clearing. It wasn't him. It was a man in a suit, an investigator. He had been briefed on her condition, she realized. He looked at her with solemn eyes, his expression unreadable. Miss, he said, his voice low and controlled. I'm Detective Harris. I know this is difficult, but we need to talk. I need to ask you a few questions. Her chest tightened. The last thing she wanted was to relive the nightmare, to recount it all. But she knew what he meant. They needed answers. They needed to know who had done this, who had pushed her to the edge. She closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing hard. She couldn't escape.
Not yet.
But she had to speak. For herself. For what was left of her. And for the chance to stop him from doing this to anyone else. The detective's voice was firm, but there was an undertone of understanding, a quiet compassion. We'll take it slow, he said, as if sensing the storm of emotions crashing inside her. Her hands were still trembling, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, to steady the rising panic. His presence, calm and methodical, almost made her feel safe, almost. But the fear still loomed like a shadow in the corners of her mind. The detective didn't press her immediately. He let the silence hang between them, giving her time to gather herself. She could hear the faint beep of the heart monitor beside her, the rhythmic sound a painful reminder that she was still here, alive, but not unbroken. Can you tell me what happened? He asked after a long pause. She didn't answer right away. Her throat felt tight. Her tongue felt like stone. How could she put it into words? How could she explain the suffocating terror, the helplessness? Her mind flashed to the alley, to the cold, dark figures, to the glint of the knife. The images were as real as if they were happening again. She closed her eyes, steadying herself against the tide of memories threatening to pull her under. I was running, she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the memory. I thought I could escape, but he was too close. I couldn't get away. The words felt weak, as if they didn't fully capture the horror of what had happened. But it was the truth. She had tried. She had tried with everything she had to get away, but it hadn't been enough. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as if trying to anchor herself in reality. Do you remember his face? The detective pressed, his voice gentle but insistent. Her breath caught. His face.
She did.
She remembered every detail, his tall frame, the way he had moved, the suffocating heat of his breath against her neck. But the one thing she couldn't remember clearly was his face. There was a flicker, a flash of recognition deep in her mind. But the clarity she needed, the certainty, wasn't there. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The detective nodded, as if he expected this, as if he had known it wouldn't be easy. We'll help you, he said. We have the evidence. We'll get him. But you need to remember what you can. Every detail. His words were meant to reassure her, to push her forward, but the weight of them was too much. The idea that the nightmare could still be out there, waiting, had never felt more real. Her stomach twisted. She swallowed hard. Her hands shook even more violently now. What if he came back? What if he wasn't done? What if he was watching her, even now? She closed her eyes again, trying to block out the fear clawing at her chest. But it was impossible. She had survived the first encounter, but something in her told her that this was far from over. It was just the beginning. Her mind raced, and the cold chill of fear spread through her, gripping her like ice. She wanted to ask the detective what would happen next. Would they find him? Would they stop him before he could hurt someone else? But the words caught in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to speak, not yet. Her eyes flickered open again, and she saw the detective watching her, his face a mixture of concern and determination. But she wasn't focused on him anymore. Her eyes darted to the door. Was it just her imagination, or did she see something move? A shadow. A figure. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she flinched, her body going rigid. The detective noticed her reaction. "What is it?" he asked, his tone sharp, alert. But there was nothing. Nothing in the doorway. Just the empty hallway beyond, the sterile white walls of the hospital stretching out in silence. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She was losing her grip on reality. The memories were playing tricks on her, mixing with the present. "I thought I saw something," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I thought he was here." The detective's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained calm. "You're safe here," he reassured her. "We'll protect you. You're not alone." She nodded, forcing herself to believe it. But the knot of dread in her stomach refused to loosen. It twisted tighter with each passing second. She had survived the attack. She had escaped him, but she could still feel him. She could still hear his voice in her mind, echoing with that chilling command, "You're not getting away." The detective's words broke through her spiraling thoughts. "We're going to take care of this," he said again, more firmly now. "We've got your back. We'll find him, and we'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But part of her still wondered, if they didn't find him in time, if they couldn't track him down, would he come back for her? Would he finish what he had started? The detective seemed to read her mind, his expression softening. He placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but steady. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said. She nodded again, though the words felt hollow. Because the truth was, she didn't know if anyone could protect her from the kind of terror that was now etched into her very soul. The detective seemed to sense her unease and hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I know it's hard to trust right now, but we have your back. We'll keep you safe. And we'll get him." Her eyes dropped to the bed, her hands still trembling, though now it was less from physical pain and more from something much deeper, much darker. "I don't know how to feel," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And that was the truth. She didn't know how to feel. Grateful? Yes. She had survived. But the fear still lived in her, gnawing at her insides. She couldn't escape it. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, the nightmare wasn't over. Not until they found him. Not until he was locked away for good. The detective's steady presence offered some comfort, but the unease never left her. It clung to her like a second skin, a shadow she couldn't shake. Her mind was in chaos, pulling her in every direction. She wanted to feel safe. She wanted to trust that the police would catch him, that the nightmare would be over. But with every passing moment, the fear burrowed deeper into her soul. The detective leaned back slightly, giving her space, but his gaze never wavered. "Do you want to tell me more about what happened?" he asked gently, but there was a firm note behind the words. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the question press down on her chest. How could she explain the suffocating terror, the feeling of being utterly powerless in that moment?
The alley.
The rain. His voice in her ear. The knife. It was all still so vivid. Still so real. She shuddered involuntarily, the memory fresh and raw. She wanted to say something. She wanted to give him the details that could help. But her mind kept drifting back to the worst parts, the parts she didn't want to relive. His face, still hidden in the shadows, his hand gripping her arm with cold certainty. The terrifying realization that there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. The detective seemed to sense her hesitation, and he leaned forward just a bit, his voice soft but insistent. I know it's hard. You don't have to say everything right now. But the more we know, the better we can protect you. We need every detail. Anything that stands out. Her hands clenched the edges of the blanket, the fabric twisting beneath her fingers. Anything that stands out. The words echoed in her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the images. But then something flickered. A memory. A small detail that she hadn't thought about before. Her breath caught as she forced it into focus. She remembered the way he moved. How he hadn't rushed at her like most would expect.
No.
He had been patient. Controlled. It wasn't just the knife. It wasn't just the fear of the blade against her skin. It was the way he had spoken. So calm. So sure of himself. She could still hear his voice in her head, "You're not getting away." The words were different now, though. They didn't sound like a threat anymore. They sounded like a promise. She swallowed, the cold dread settling in her chest once again. She started, her voice fragile. I remember something. Something about the way he moved. It was too calm. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. The detective's expression didn't change, but she saw the way his eyes sharpened. Calm, he repeated. How so? She hesitated, struggling to find the words. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. It was almost like he was enjoying it. Like he was playing with me. Her hands trembled again. She had to stop, but the words kept pouring out. His voice, it was so cold. Like he was certain I couldn't escape. The detective leaned forward, his eyes intent on her. And what about his appearance? Can you remember anything about how he looked? Anything at all? Her mind raced, her pulse quickening. She could remember the figure.
Tall. Broad.
But his face? The details were still so unclear. She shook her head slowly.
No.
Not really. Just shadows. But it felt like he was hiding his face on purpose. I don't know why, but I think he was trying to make sure I didn't see him clearly. The detective nodded, his expression darkening. This is good, he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. We're getting closer. We need to follow these details. They might help us track him down. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to the hope that they would find him, that the nightmare would end. But the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, refused to leave her. She glanced toward the window, the pale light of dawn creeping through the blinds. Would the fear ever go away? Would she ever feel safe again? The detective's voice broke through her thoughts once more. We'll get him, he promised. You're not alone in this. She nodded weakly, but deep down, she wasn't sure if she could believe that anymore. Because she knew one thing for sure. The nightmare wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed felt like they moved in slow motion, each one dragging her deeper into a state of constant vigilance. The detective's words echoed in her mind. We'll get him. But the longer she waited for answers, the more her doubt began to eat away at her. They said they were investigating. They said they were close. But what if they weren't? What if he was still out there, watching her, waiting for the right moment to finish what he started? She couldn't shake the feeling, a gut-wrenching, ever-present sense that he wasn't done with her yet. Her hands were still shaking every time she left her apartment. She kept the blinds drawn, the locks on the door checked repeatedly. She couldn't stand the feeling of being exposed, vulnerable. Every car that passed, every footstep she heard behind her, sent her heart racing. The fear, no longer just a memory, was now a part of her, a constant companion that followed her wherever she went. And then one evening, as she sat in her living room, the phone rang. The sound pierced the silence, and her heart skipped in her chest. She stared at the screen, her breath caught in her throat. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Her hand hovered over the phone, hesitation paralyzing her. What if it was him? Her mind raced back to that night, the voice she heard in the dark, the chilling certainty in his words. She could still hear him. You thought you could escape. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She didn't know what to do. But then, with a shaky breath, she answered. Hellos. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse with fear. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a moment too long. She could feel the tension building, like the air was thick with something sinister. And then, a voice low, familiar and unmistakable, finally came through. Did you think you could outrun me? Her blood turned to ice. It was him. The same voice. The same cold, mocking tone. She froze, the phone pressed to her ear, unable to move. The voice continued, chilling her to her very core. I told you. You're not getting away. I'm still here. Watching. Waiting. The words felt like an invisible hand closing around her throat. She wanted to scream, to hang up, but her body refused to obey. Her eyes flickered around the room, her pulse racing as her mind spiraled into panic. He was here. He was still here. Why? She forced out, her voice trembling. Why are you doing this? There was a pause, then a laugh, soft and cold, that sent shivers down her spine. Because you're mine now, he said. You'll never be free. The line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the phone. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of his words pressing in on her. She had been wrong. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun.
He was still out there.
And now he was closer than ever. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, and the air seemed to thicken with each passing second. She was trapped. Trapped in her own home. Trapped in her own mind. The detective's words about protection, about keeping her safe, felt distant now. They seemed like lies she had been telling herself. Because she knew one thing with terrifying clarity. He was not going to stop. Not until he had what he wanted. And she had no idea how much longer she could keep running. The ringing in her ears from the call hadn't stopped. It echoed like a drumbeat inside her head. Her breath came in short gasps, and her hands were still shaking as she set the phone down, too numb to move. The world around her felt unreal. Was this really happening? Was he really still out there? She tried to steady herself.
Tried to think.
But the reality hit her all at once.
The door.
The windows. Every creak, every rustle, felt like a warning. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. She rose unsteadily from the couch, her legs trembling beneath her weight. The room seemed to tilt, her vision blurring from the panic clawing at her chest. She staggered toward the window, her heart hammering as she peeked through the blinds. Nothing. But that didn't mean he wasn't there. Watching her, waiting for the perfect moment. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding in a whirlwind of terror. She couldn't breathe.
Couldn't think.
She grabbed her bag, her hands moving on autopilot. The floor beneath her feet felt distant, as though she were floating, detached from reality. She had to get out. She had to leave. He's out there. He's coming for you. The thought echoed in her mind, louder than her own heartbeat. She grabbed the keys, her fingers fumbling as she slid them into her pocket. Every movement felt too slow, too deliberate.
Go. Go now.
She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. Her mind was a blur of fear and confusion, her body acting before she could even process what was happening. She opened the door, and the cold night air hit her like a slap. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her feet carried her down the hallway, past the shadows of the building. Each step felt like it took her farther from safety, but also closer to it. The air outside felt different, but still thick with the fear that had consumed her. She needed answers. She needed to be safe. But more than that, she needed to escape the suffocating grip of terror that had been growing inside her since the moment he spoke. She had thought she could outrun him, thought she could escape. But now she was sure this wasn't just about running. He was always going to be right behind her, always going to be watching. And no matter how far she went, she wasn't sure she could ever get far enough. Each corner she turned felt like another trap. The streets that once seemed familiar now felt like a maze. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and the panic clawed higher, tighter. She reached the nearest street, her steps echoing in the empty night, but still, it felt like the walls were closing in. The distance between her and safety seemed endless, no matter how far she ran. It was like she was tethered to him, pulled by some unseen force that would never let her go. The detective's words echoed in her mind. "We'll protect you." But those words were hollow now. The fear that had been planted in her was so deep it could never be uprooted. The world felt like it was closing in around her, the streets suffocating with shadows. And as she rounded another corner, the world seemed to hold its breath. Something was different.
She stopped.
The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She wasn't alone. There was a figure ahead of her, standing in the dark, barely visible in the dim streetlight. The outline of a man.
Tall.
Broad-shouldered. Her heart stopped in her chest. Was it him?
No. It couldn't be.
He couldn't have followed her this quickly. Her legs felt like stone, rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. He stepped forward, into the pool of light. Her heart skipped. It wasn't him. Not the same man. But he was close. Too close. He smiled, and his eyes gleamed in the darkness. But this wasn't the relief she had hoped for. This wasn't the man who could protect her. This was something worse. And as he took another step forward, she realized with horror, there was no escaping this.
Not now.
Not ever. Her pulse raced as she took an instinctive step back, the terror surging through her like an electric shock. The man's smile widened, a predator's grin. She could feel it in her gut. He was no stranger. This wasn't some random person. This wasn't a coincidence. He had been watching her too. Her breath quickened, shallow, panicked. The world around her was spinning. Looking for something, his voice was smooth, chilling, as if this were just a casual encounter on a normal night. She shook her head, backing away, her hands trembling violently. The fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, but her feet felt glued to the pavement. I need to go," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt weak, useless. He took another step forward, his gait slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You're not going anywhere," he said softly, and there was something too knowing in his tone, something that made her stomach drop. This was the trap she had been dreading. She could feel the walls closing in. Her legs screamed for her to move, to run, to get away, but every step she took back felt like it would be her last. The figure before her wasn't just a man. He was a nightmare made flesh, a twisted version of the fear she had lived with for days. "Please," she whispered, her throat tightening with panic, her body trembling with the weight of her helplessness. His eyes locked on hers, cold and empty. "You really thought you could outrun me, didn't you?" His words hung in the air, thick with malice. He took another slow step, and something in her mind snapped. She couldn't let him take another step toward her. She couldn't let him do what she feared he was going to do. Without thinking, she turned and bolted down the alley to her left. The cold night air hit her face like a slap, her feet pounding the concrete, her heart beating wildly in her chest. She wasn't sure where she was going. She didn't care. All she knew was that she couldn't stop running. Not now. She heard his footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, like he was enjoying this. The sound was like a drumbeat, each step a reminder of her terror. I'm not fast enough. I can't outrun him. The thought echoed in her mind, louder with each passing second. She rounded another corner, gasping for air, but there was no escape. The alley ahead seemed to stretch on forever. She turned sharply, trying to lose him, but then the alley was blocked. There was nowhere to go. The walls were high on either side, narrowing as the alley continued. She froze, panic flooding her veins. She was trapped. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. Her eyes darted around, looking for any kind of escape, but there was nothing. Nothing but him. He was close now, so close. She could hear the sound of his footsteps growing louder. She turned, her eyes searching for something, anything, to defend herself. But he was already there, just a few feet away, his smile widening, a twisted gleam in his eyes. You can't hide from me forever, he said, his voice smooth, but with a deadly edge. The fear washed over her in waves, and she could feel herself faltering. She was out of options. Her back pressed against the brick wall, her legs no longer able to hold her steady. But just as he took another step forward, something inside her snapped. She couldn't go down without a fight. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out, and then her eyes landed on something. A piece of metal, discarded on the ground. It was a pipe. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, gripping it with all the strength she had left. The man stopped, seeing her move, and his grin faltered for a moment. But that hesitation was all she needed. With every ounce of adrenaline in her body, she swung the pipe at him, aiming for his head. The impact was enough to make him stumble back, momentarily disoriented. But she didn't stop. She lunged again, the pipe crashing into him with a sickening thud. He let out a grunt of pain but didn't fall. Instead, he snarled, rage flashing across his face. She took a step back, her body shaking with exhaustion, fear, and the terror of what would happen next. The man wiped the blood from his lip, his smile returning, but this time it was twisted in a way that made her blood run cold. You think that's going to stop me? He growled, his voice low and dangerous. And before she could react, he lunged forward again. The pipe slipped from her hands as she tried to dodge him, but her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the cold concrete. For a moment, everything was still. Her mind raced, panic choking her throat. Her breathing was ragged, shallow. She could hear him getting closer, his footsteps echoing in the narrow alley, the sound of his every move sending a fresh wave of terror through her body. But then, in a flash of desperation, something inside her surged. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. She wasn't going to die here. Her hands scrambled over the ground, finding nothing but dirt and broken pieces of stone. But then her fingers brushed something sharp. A shard of glass. A jagged, dangerous piece that could be her only chance. Without thinking, she grabbed it, her fingers wrapping around the shard as tightly as she could manage. Her breath quickened as she heard his footsteps nearing. He was almost upon her. But just as his shadow loomed over her, she spun around, thrusting the glass shard upward with all her strength. He cried out in surprise, stumbling backward. The glass had found its mark, digging into his side, a flash of blood staining the night. For a moment, he stood there, breathless, looking at the wound in disbelief. But his rage quickly flared. His eyes burned with fury as he snarled. You think you can stop me? You're nothing, he spat. She was shaking uncontrollably, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She could barely stand, but she knew she couldn't give him a second to recover. As he staggered back toward her, she pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the pain shooting through her body. She could feel the weight of the fear crushing her, but this time, she had a weapon. And she wasn't going down without a fight. With one final surge of energy, she lunged at him, the glass shard raised. But before she could make contact, a car screeched to a halt at the end of the alley. The headlights illuminated the scene, and a figure rushed toward them. No, not just a figure, but the detective. The man froze. The detective's voice rang out, commanding, filled with authority. "Drop it."
Now.
For the first time in what felt like forever, she saw the man hesitate. The detective wasn't backing down. And then, in the flashing headlights, the man turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her heart still pounding in her chest. The nightmare wasn't over, but it was close. The detective rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, his presence a sudden anchor in the overwhelming storm of fear and confusion that still raged inside her. She could barely process what had just happened. The adrenaline had drained from her body, leaving her hollow and trembling, her hands still gripping the glass shard, which now felt foreign and useless in her fingers. The detective's voice was soft but urgent. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Her mind was still reeling, but her body was finally surrendering to exhaustion. The night, the fear, the terror, it was too much. It all crashed down on her at once. She felt her tears begin to spill, hot and unrelenting. The detective placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now. He won't be able to hurt you again." She nodded, but the words didn't fully sink in. The shadow of the man's face, the coldness in his voice, still lingered in her mind. She wasn't sure if she'd ever be truly free of it. But for now, she was here.
Alive.
And somehow, that felt like both a relief and a burden. The detective helped her to her feet, supporting her as they walked out of the alley and toward the car that had arrived just in time. The flashing lights of the police vehicles reflected in the wet pavement, the world around them still pulsing with the remnants of the chaos. As they drove away, she looked out the window, the weight of everything beginning to sink in. The terror would stay with her, but the man was gone, for now at least. And as the car rolled through the quiet streets, she realized something she hadn't yet fully understood. Fear didn't just take over. It changed you, transformed you in ways you couldn't explain. But it also taught you something valuable: how to survive, how to fight back when the world turned against you. She had fought. She had survived. The detective spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You're strong. You've been through more than anyone should have to." She met his gaze for a brief moment, offering a small, exhausted smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could heal. And as the car carried her into the night, the darkness no longer felt as suffocating.